On the morning of December 12, 1939, at exactly 9:04, the forest near the Kollaa front lay sealed under a depth of winter that few soldiers on Earth had ever faced. The air was so cold that breath turned solid the moment it left the lungs. Pine branches sagged under the weight of ice. Every sound died before it traveled 10 steps. Yet through this frozen stillness moved the men of the Red Army, confident in their numbers, certain that no group of farmers could stop the largest military force in the world. They advanced with the heavy rhythm of steel on snow. Their coats cracked like frozen canvas. Their rifles glimmered in the pale sun. Then one man simply dropped. No roar, no blast of powder, only a faint hiss swallowed by the snow. Another man fell moments later, then another. In the silence of that morning, something unseen reached out across the white waste and unstitched the patrol one soldier at a time. The survivors whispered of a ghost, a presence without breath, without light, without warning. But the truth was far stranger. The ghost was a quiet farmer named Simo Hayha, and he was about to change the logic of winter warfare with methods so simple they defied military doctrine. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe WW2 Secret Archives and leave a comment about which country you're watching the video from. In the final weeks of 1939, the map of Northern Europe looked calm from a distance. Yet along the long frontier between the Soviet Union and Finland, tension had been rising for months. Joseph Stalin wanted land, harbors, and islands that would push Finland farther from Leningrad. He wanted depth. He wanted a shield. And in an age defined by rapid mechanized warfare, he believed a shallow frontier could one day invite catastrophe. Finland refused his demands. The refusal was quiet but absolute. It came from a nation that had spent centuries surviving larger empires, harder winters, and long stretches of hardship. It was a refusal shaped by geography and by memory. When the artillery shells fell near the village of Mainila, the Soviets claimed Finland had fired first. Most foreign observers doubted the story, yet the accusation was enough for Stalin. On November 30th, the Red Army crossed the frozen border with overwhelming force. Nearly 1 million Soviet troops marched or rode toward the Finnish lines. Hundreds of tanks growled across snowfields. Aircraft circled above like dark flecks against a pale sky. To many, especially in newspapers across the Atlantic, the outcome looked certain. Finland was small. Finland was outnumbered. Finland would fall. But the Soviet command had misread the land they were invading. Finland was not an open plain suited for rapid armored thrusts. Nearly 7 out of 10 square miles were forest. Roads were few. Lakes lay frozen under sheets of ice. Snowfall could bury a man to the waist by late afternoon. The temperature often drifted toward levels that punished metal, fuel, and flesh. Engines stalled. Grease thickened. Steel turned brittle. A tank that worked well in mild weather might become a cold iron coffin the moment its lubricants stiffened. Logistics failed long before rifles cracked. Finland had no illusions about matching the Red Army tank for tank or aircraft for aircraft. Instead, Finnish commanders studied the land that had shaped their people for centuries. They knew how snow muffled sound, how trees broke line of sight, and how darkness arrived early in winter. They understood that an army built on the idea of overwhelming pressure would need wide space to maneuver. The forests around Kollaa offered the opposite. They offered narrow paths, shadowed glades, and long funnels where Soviet columns would stretch thin and vulnerable. That understanding gave rise to a pattern of fighting known as motti tactics. In Finnish, the word motti describes a bundle of firewood cut into manageable pieces. The idea translated neatly into war. Finnish units on skis would slice a long Soviet column into isolated pockets. Supply wagons became stranded. Communications broke. Tanks found themselves trapped between drifts of snow and frozen marsh. Infantry were forced to dig in without warmth or food. The cold did not favor machines or mass. It favored the patient, the quiet, and the light-footed. and Finland had generations of men and women who understood that form of survival. The Finnish word for their national spirit is sisu. It is a difficult word to translate. It means endurance beyond reason. It means an unyielding calm under pressure. It means doing what must be done even when the odds forbid hope. Sisu does not win battles by itself, but it keeps a soldier moving when logic suggests stopping. It was sisu that filled the ranks of the Finnish defenders at Kollaa, many of whom were farmers, woodsmen, or hunters. They knew the forest as a neighbor, not as an obstacle. They knew how snow altered footfall. They knew when wind was about to shift. These instincts could not be taught quickly. They were inherited through long winters spent outdoors. Among these defenders was a quiet man named Simo Hayha. He was 33 years old when the war began. He had spent his life in the village of Rautjarvi, near the frontier. He was not a soldier by profession. He was a farmer, a hunter, and a marksman in the Finnish Civil Guard. His accuracy was not the product of doctrine. It was the product of thousands of hours spent aiming at foxes, pine cones, or distant shadows across fields of snow. He understood how cold bent the arc of a bullet. He understood how moisture clung to metal. He understood how the air thickened when the temperature fell. These small details mattered more in Finland than any manual written for temperate climates. When Simo received his service rifle, it was the Finnish M28-30, a refined version of the older Russian Mosin Nagant. It had iron sights, simple, durable, and familiar. His officers offered him a modern scope. They believed magnification would give him an advantage. Yet, Simo declined it. The decision defied military logic. Every major army in the world preached the value of scopes. But Simo was not thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about winter. A scope was glass. Glass could glint. Even a faint flash could reveal a position across hundreds of yards in a landscape as white as bone. A scope also fogged when warm breath met cold air. A sniper might raise his rifle and see nothing but a blur. Most important, a scope forced the shooter to lift his head slightly higher off the ground. In a field of snow, a few inches could be the difference between a clean shot and a deadly mistake. Iron sights kept him low. They kept him hidden. They kept him alive. Cold altered every part of a sniper's work. Breath became a visible cloud that drifted toward the sky. Muzzle blast kicked up powdery snow that exposed a firing point. Clothing stiffened and resisted movement. The rifles themselves required careful preparation. Oil had to be removed or replaced with grease that could withstand sub-zero conditions. Bolts had to be tested repeatedly to ensure they did not freeze. Even the trigger could feel different. A glove could make the pull inconsistent. A bare finger could freeze to the steel in minutes. These conditions set strict limits. A sniper could not fire quickly without risking detection. He could not remain still for long without risking frostbite. He could not travel without leaving tracks unless he used skis. He had to understand wind patterns, the thickness of ice, and the way sound traveled through trees. The environment was an enemy as relentless as any soldier. But for those who understood its rules, the environment could also become a shield. Simo recognized these boundaries clearly. He recognized that his window of effective fire lay between roughly 150 and 400 meters. He recognized that he could fire only once or twice from a position before counterfire found him. He recognized that a sniper in winter fought as much against breath, snow, and silence as against human targets. This understanding shaped every decision he made. It would soon turn a quiet farmer into the most feared man on the Kollaa front. What he did next, and how he did it, would show how a single soldier, armed with nothing more than skill and simple modifications, could influence the rhythm of an entire battlefield. The first time Simo Hayha went out alone, the forest was still dark. The winter sky held only a narrow band of grey above the trees. He moved on skis without a sound. Each glide carried him deeper into the stretch of no man's land, where patrols disappeared and rumors were born. He carried a small pack with bread and sugar, a submachine gun for emergencies, and his rifle resting across his back. The snow under him was dry and brittle. It crunched softly, but only when he pushed hard. When he let momentum take him, he became a shadow among trees. He stopped at a low rise shaped by the wind. A fallen log lay nearby, half buried under a crust of ice. This was enough. He knelt. He brushed the snow smooth in front of his firing position. Then he pressed down with his mittens, shaping a shallow arc. When the surface was flat, he poured water from his canteen and let the cold take it. Within minutes, the layer hardened into a small shield. It was simple. It was quiet. It prevented his rifle from kicking snow into the air. No spray meant no obvious signature. Before he settled in, he scooped a handful of snow and packed it beneath his tongue. The cold pressed against his jaw, slowing his breath. When he exhaled, the air already matched the temperature of the world around him. No clouds, no vapor, nothing a counter-sniper could see through a scope. With preparation done, he became motionless. The forest grew still. Minutes passed, then an hour. Light seeped slowly across the treetops. Snowflakes drifted from a sky without wind. Far ahead, through the branches, shapes appeared. A Soviet patrol moved in a loose line, rifles slung, boots sinking deep into the snow. Their bodies were dark against the white landscape. Their breath floated above them like thin grey smoke. Simo waited. He counted the men. He studied their rhythm. When he finally eased his rifle forward, it moved with the silence of falling frost. The iron sights framed the last man in the column. The shot broke the stillness with a short crack. The man fell before the others realized what they had heard. The patrol froze. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the leader signaled with his hand. One soldier darted forward. Another crouched low. Their movements stirred snow into the air. A second crack folded the radio operator to the ground. Panic spread. Men dropped behind shallow mounds that offered no cover. Snow muffled their shouts. Simo fired again. Then again. In less time than it took for the sun to lift above the treetops, most of the patrol lay in the snow. Only 3 survived. They hid where they fell, afraid to move, convinced that a ghost had hunted them. It was the first day of a pattern that repeated again and again. At dawn, Simo would slip forward. By dusk, he would ski back to his unit. His commanding officer would ask him for his count. Simo would answer with a single number. 5, 8, 12. The routine never changed. The simplicity unsettled men who lived with him. They admired him. They feared for him. They wondered how long luck could hold in a war where a single misstep meant death. The Soviet command heard the reports. At first, they dismissed them as exaggeration. No sniper, they argued, could achieve such numbers. Soviet doctrine taught patience, 1 shot, 1 kill, then hours of waiting. The Finnish claims did not fit the manual, but manuals do not rewrite experience. As the casualties mounted, Soviet officers along the Kollaa front recognized that something was wrong. Patrols did not return. Encampments came under accurate fire. Officers were singled out by a shooter they could not see. Confidence eroded. Men hesitated to leave their shelters. The forest no longer felt vast. It felt watched. In response, the Red Army deployed its best snipers. These were graduates of the Moscow Sniper School. They carried rifles fitted with modern scopes that gave them clarity and reach. They had trained for years. They knew how to read terrain. They knew how to hunt. Yet they were not hunting in a classroom. They were hunting in Finland. They were hunting a man who knew the cold better than they understood their weapons. One by one, they took up positions. One by one, they exposed themselves without realizing it. The winter sun rose low on the horizon. Light struck the glass of a scope. The reflection was faint. It lasted only a moment. But to Simo, lying behind his iron sights, it was enough. He aligned the front post and squeezed. The bullet traveled silently through the frozen air. It struck the scope, shattered the glass, and continued through the eye behind it. The Soviet sniper toppled backward. Simo moved before the man hit the ground. By the end of the week, several of the Soviet Union's best marksmen had fallen. Their rifles were found with holes punched cleanly through their optics. The Red Army escalated. If trained snipers could not solve the problem, perhaps heavy weapons could. A new practice emerged. Each time a lone shot dropped a Soviet soldier, artillery crews were ordered to blanket the suspected area. Mortars and shells rained down with violence that shook the entire front. Trees splintered. Snow rose in violent plumes. Craters opened like dark wounds in the ground. The bombardments were indiscriminate. Hundreds of shells might fall because of a single crack of a rifle. The method was wasteful, but commanders hoped it might flush out the ghost in white. Simo could not escape every blast. One afternoon, an artillery barrage shattered the forest around his firing nest. Branches fell like spears. Shrapnel tore through bark and earth. When the barrage lifted, his officers believed he had been crushed. Yet an hour later, he returned to the dugout on foot, his uniform torn, his face darkened by soot. He downplayed the experience with a brief remark about the noise. Then he asked for food and prepared for the next day. By late winter, Soviet frustration grew into desperation. They assembled a counter-sniper platoon, 30 men chosen for skill and toughness. They carried the new SVT rifles with scopes. They moved with machine gun support. Their single mission was clear: find the White Death and kill him. They advanced before dawn into the woods, spreading out in a practiced formation. Their boots pressed deep into the snow. Their scopes caught the sun in flickers of light. They did not know that Simo had been watching them for hours. He was buried beneath a snowdrift nearly 400 meters away. Only the faint rise of his rifle barrel showed where he lay. He let the first 10 men pass. He let the machine gun team pass. He waited for the radio operator at the rear. Then he fired. The shot was absorbed by the snow. The radio operator dropped. The platoon reacted instantly. They dove for cover. The machine gunners opened fire on a distant tree line. Simo had already moved. He glided on skis to a new nest he had prepared the previous day. When the lieutenant called for his men to advance, a second shot came from their flank. The lieutenant fell face first into the snow. The platoon was now blind. They had no leader, no radio, no clear direction. They huddled together as night fell and the cold intensified. A small group of 6 tried to light a fire. They needed heat. They needed comfort. But the flame betrayed them. From only 200 meters away, Simo stepped from behind a cluster of trees with his submachine gun. The burst lasted seconds. When morning came, Finnish patrols found 27 bodies. This battle marked a turning point. The Soviet command interpreted it not as bad luck, but as humiliation. They had sent trained men. They had sent a full platoon. They had used artillery. Nothing worked. So they abandoned precision and turned to force. They ordered what Finnish soldiers later called the Kollaa Holocaust. Artillery crews were told not to aim at targets but to erase entire grid squares. The forest shook under tens of thousands of shells. Snow turned black with soot. Trees were stripped to broken stumps. The once quiet wilderness became a shattered wasteland. Paradoxically, the destruction made Simo's work easier. The constant roar of artillery masked the crack of his rifle. Smoke and splintered trunks offered new concealment. He moved through craters that hid him from Soviet sightlines. His tally climbed with a steady, almost mechanical rhythm. 200, 300, 400. Finnish officers tracked the numbers with disbelief. Soviet diaries recorded growing terror. The White Death had become a force of nature rather than a man. Then came March 6, 1940. It was day 100 of the war. The Soviet Union launched a final massive assault on the Kollaa front. Mortars shook the ground. Infantry pushed through smoke and falling snow. Simo was in his firing position. Working the bolt of his rifle with practiced efficiency, he dropped one attacker. Then another. He reloaded. He fired again. Around him, the air pulsed with explosions. Dirt and ice fell in sheets. Somewhere in that chaos, a Soviet counter-sniper lifted his rifle. The man fired an explosive round. The bullet traveled 300 meters before it struck Simo's face. It entered his left cheek and detonated inside his mouth. Bone shattered. Flesh tore. Teeth broke apart and scattered into the snow. Simo collapsed instantly. His rifle fell from his hand. His world went white. Finnish soldiers nearby saw him fall. They reached his position under fire and pulled him out of the crater. They believed he was dead. His face was destroyed. He did not breathe. They carried him to the rear and placed him among the fallen. Hours passed. Maybe a day passed. Then, against all expectation, a faint movement drew a soldier's eye. A leg twitched. Simo Hayha was alive. It was the end of his war. But it was not the end of his story. The men who fought beside Simo Hayha at Kollaa lived in a world defined by cold, hunger, and silence. Their shelters were dug into snowbanks or built into shallow pits roofed with pine branches. Frost gathered on their blankets. Ice crept around the rims of their tin cups. At night, they huddled together for warmth. Each morning, they stepped into a forest that seemed to breathe cold through every branch. They respected Simo because he moved through this world without complaint. He spoke little. He asked for nothing special. He performed his duties with the same quiet focus, whether he was patching his boots or preparing to hunt. Life on the front demanded more than courage. It demanded discipline of the body. A soldier could not let his fingers stiffen. He could not let exhaustion overcome him. Even lighting a fire was a decision weighed against risk. Most Finnish soldiers understood that the flames could draw gunfire, yet the cold was merciless. It crept into bones and joints. It made simple tasks heavy and slow. Many believed the winter would take them if the enemy did not. In this harsh landscape, Simo's daily departures felt like a kind of bravery that came from deep within. He walked into the same cold that nearly broke seasoned men. Yet he returned each evening with the same measured calm. The soldiers on the opposite side lived a different hardship. Many Soviet troops had arrived from milder regions. They wore uniforms that were never meant for the deep north. Their coats froze stiff. Their boots soaked through. Their hands cracked from exposure. In their diaries, they wrote of fear that felt heavier than the cold itself. They feared the silence. They feared the endless white. They feared stepping into open ground where a single breath might betray them. For these men, the idea of a hidden marksman became a weight that never lifted. It shaped how they walked, how they spoke, and how they slept. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every quiet moment felt like a warning. The wounded faced another trial. There were no easy rescues in this terrain. If a man cried out, his voice drifted upward like smoke. Soviet soldiers learned not to run toward the sound. They believed a sniper waited for the first responder. This belief broke something inside them. It severed the bond between comrades. Some wrote home saying they no longer trusted their instincts. They did not fear death as much as the uncertainty that preceded it. When Simo fell, he entered a different battle, a battle inside his own shattered body. Finnish medics worked quickly. They bound what remained of his face. They stopped the bleeding. They carried him over terrain he had crossed countless times on his own. But now he drifted in and out of darkness. Surgeons at the field hospital fought to save him. They washed away debris. They stabilized his breathing. They did what they could with the tools of a small wartime facility. Later, in a larger hospital, he endured surgery after surgery. Doctors rebuilt his jaw with bone taken from his hip. They crafted a new cheek from skin grafted off his thigh. He healed slowly, surrounded by other wounded men who whispered their fears at night. In that dim ward, stripped of weapons and winter camouflage, Simo was simply another soldier fighting for his life. The war receded beyond the walls. The forest grew distant. Yet his recovery carried the same quiet resolve that had defined him in the snow. He rarely spoke. He endured pain without theatrics. His nurses remembered him as calm, modest, and courteous traits that had been with him long before the world learned his name. The human cost of the Winter War did not lie only in casualty lists or battle reports. It lived in the stories of men who survived with scars invisible and visible alike. It lived in the men who froze beside trenches, in those who carried wounded comrades through waist-deep snow, and in those who waited in hospital beds, unsure whether they would ever return home. Simo's journey, though extraordinary, was part of this larger human struggle, one shaped not by numbers, but by the quiet endurance of ordinary individuals. Across the Atlantic, the Winter War reached the American public through brief newspaper columns and grainy photographs of men standing against the snow. The conflict was small in scale compared with the unfolding crisis in Europe, yet the story of Finland's resistance stirred something familiar in the American imagination. It echoed older tales of outnumbered settlers holding a frontier. It echoed the belief that determination and skill could hold back a much larger force. American editorials described the Finnish defenders as a nation of riflemen. Some drew comparisons to pioneers who had survived harsh winters and long odds with little more than grit and steady aim. American policymakers watched the war with concern. The Soviet Union's assault on a smaller neighbor seemed to confirm fears about the spread of authoritarian power. Though isolationist sentiment remained strong in the United States, the moral clarity of Finland's position resonated with the public. Newspapers reported on volunteer groups that raised funds for medical supplies. Others wrote about American pilots who considered joining the Finnish Air Force. Official support remained limited, but sympathy ran deep. In Europe, the reaction was more immediate. Leaders in Britain and France viewed the conflict as proof that Stalin's army was poorly prepared for modern war. Intelligence services tracked reports of Soviet divisions stalled in forests, tanks frozen in place, and morale shaken by constant losses. Military observers studied Finland's use of terrain and small unit mobility. They noted that an army dependent on massed formations could be crippled by weather, landscape, and poor leadership. The lessons were clear. Though few understood how soon those lessons would matter, Germany watched with a different intention. Adolf Hitler had long believed that the Soviet Union could collapse under pressure. The Winter War strengthened that belief. Reports of Soviet units breaking under cold and confusion suggested that the Red Army was weaker than German planners had estimated. Hitler concluded that the Soviet state was structurally fragile, that its officers lacked initiative, and that its troops were unable to adapt quickly to changing conditions. These impressions shaped the early planning for Operation Barbarossa. Though Germany underestimated the scale and resilience of the Soviet system, the failures in Finland helped convince Hitler that a rapid invasion could succeed. Neutral countries drew other lessons. Scandinavia recognized the vulnerability of small nations caught between great powers. Diplomats studied how Finland used its geography to offset overwhelming force. Military staffs across Europe examined the effectiveness of camouflage, skis, and decentralized tactics. Many nations realized that morale and national unity could become decisive factors in conflicts where conventional balance favored the aggressor. The story of one Finnish sniper also reached foreign newspapers. His name was usually misspelled. His kill count was debated. His methods were described in vague terms. But the idea of a small man from a rural village holding back an empire captured worldwide imagination. For many abroad, Simo Hayha became a symbol of the Finnish struggle itself, quiet, determined, and unbroken despite impossible odds. The Winter War did not dramatically reshape global alliances. It did not shift borders far beyond the disputed frontier. Yet its influence rippled outward. It exposed weaknesses in the Soviet military. It altered the calculations of European powers. It shaped perceptions in Washington. And it left the world wondering how a small nation, armed with little more than skill and resolve, had managed to stand firm against one of the largest armies on Earth. When the Winter War ended on March 13, 1940, the guns along the Kollaa front finally fell silent. The ceasefire arrived with a weight that felt heavier than the months of fighting that had come before. Forests that had once absorbed every footstep now lay shattered. Scarred by shell fire and littered with broken equipment, snowdrifts covered bodies of men from both sides, preserving them in the cold as if time itself refused to move forward without acknowledgement. Finnish units pulled back from their forward positions with mixed emotions. They had held the line. They had inflicted enormous losses. Yet they now surrendered territory they had fought to protect. On paper, the Soviet Union had won. Finland was forced to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty. It ceded roughly 1/10 of its land, including areas where families had lived for generations. Tens of thousands were displaced. Villages were evacuated. Farmland and forests that had shaped Finnish life for centuries were now behind a new border. Yet the strategic victory came at a staggering cost for the Soviet Union. They suffered well over 1 million casualties, including those lost to cold, starvation, and disease. They lost thousands of tanks that had frozen or broken under winter strain. They lost aircraft to weather, to malfunctions, and to skilled Finnish pilots who operated despite overwhelming odds. These losses echoed far beyond the battlefields. Foreign observers questioned how a superpower could pay so much for so little. The Soviet leadership, embarrassed by failure, launched internal reviews and purges that reshaped its officer corps. New training programs were created. Equipment was redesigned. Winter doctrine was rewritten. Yet the shadow of the Winter War lingered, influencing Soviet thinking long after the final shots were fired. For Finland, the legacy was more complex. The war became a symbol of national determination. It reinforced the idea that unity, preparation, and intimate knowledge of homeland could counter even the greatest pressure. The sacrifice of the soldiers at Kollaa became part of Finnish identity. Their endurance shaped military planning for decades. Their use of small unit tactics, camouflage, and mobility influenced doctrines far beyond Scandinavia. Modern armies studied the conflict for lessons on cold weather operations, decentralized decision-making, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. At the center of that legacy stood Simo Hayha. His confirmed tally of more than 500 sniper kills in less than 100 days remains unmatched. His additional successes with the submachine gun brought his total impact even higher. Yet numbers alone cannot explain his influence. His methods showed how observation, preparation, and adaptation could defeat advanced technology. His refusal to use a scope demonstrated how simplicity could outperform sophistication in the right conditions. His small choices packing snow to hide his breath, freezing a slab of ice to mask muzzle blast, moving after every shot became examples of fieldcraft taught in military programs around the world. His survival after being struck by an explosive bullet added another layer to his legend. Simo endured multiple surgeries, months of recovery, and years of rehabilitation. When he emerged from the hospital, he carried the scars of war permanently. Yet he returned to a quiet life, raising dogs, hunting, and tending to his land. He did not seek recognition. He did not write grand accounts of his exploits. He answered questions with modesty, reducing his achievements to practice and necessity. The broader implications of his actions extended beyond Finland. Adolf Hitler's perception of Soviet weakness, shaped in part by the Winter War, helped convince him that an invasion of the Soviet Union would be swift. Operation Barbarossa launched in 1941, drawing the world into a conflict that would claim tens of millions of lives. Historians debate how much the Winter War influenced that decision, but many agree that Soviet failures in Finland contributed to Hitler's fatal miscalculations. In this sense, the ripple from a few thousand Finnish defenders, and from one quiet marksman in particular, extended into the largest land war in human history. Today, the forests of Kollaa have grown back. Snow still falls quietly over the landscape. Visitors walk through areas where trenches once stood and where artillery once tore the land apart. They find markers that tell fragments of the story. They find silence that feels older than the war itself. And if they look closely at dawn or dusk, they can imagine the faint shape of a man in white moving through the trees with practiced ease. They can sense the patience that once defined the battlefield. The legacy of the Winter War endures not because of grand speeches or sweeping victories, but because of the human spirit revealed in moments of extreme hardship. It endures through the concept of sisu, through the idea that resilience, clarity, and quiet resolve can carry individuals and nations through their darkest hours. It endures in the memory of men who faced overwhelming force and refused to break. For those who study the Second World War, these stories matter. They remind us that history is shaped not only by armies and governments, but by individuals whose actions ripple outward in ways they never intended. If you value stories like this, stories of courage, innovation, don't forget to subscribe WW2 Secret Archives before checking out the next video in the end screen.